things that drove me to study this 500 years of history, and the patterns were, first, the creation of an enormous amount of debt and the monetization of that debt. Second, the amounts of internal conflict between populists of the right and populists of the left, with the largest wealth and income gap since the 1930s. And third, the rise of a great power, comparable power. All three of those things I knew happened the last time in the 1930 to 45 period, but that's a sample size of one. And I needed to see the sample size of many cases. So I studied 10 major empires, the 10 most important ones, going back the last 500 years. And then I studied the dynasties in China since the Tang Dynasty, which is 600, to see that pattern and that cycle. And so, as you can imagine, each one is an issue. Each one is a problem. And when those three problems come together, that's a dangerous set of circumstances. So that's what prompted me to look at those patterns in history. Yeah, so the patterns that we see in history have cause-effect relationships. It's not so much the patterns, because that would just require blind faith that the patterns continue, but you could see the cause-effect relationships at each time and seeing those. And I'm a very practical guy. Like, I'm doing this not to study history. I'm doing it for the purpose of I have to be positioned today, tomorrow, the next day in the markets to make the right decisions. But politics and geopolitics and all of this economics all matter. So, what we see, and I measure it in statistics and probability. So you could see it in the book, or I did a YouTube video that also gives a condensed version of that called The Changing World Order. You can see the measurements, and you can see it happen repeatedly. And so that cycle, which if you like, I'll describe, that cycle has brought us to a point where there are consequences for the conditions that we find ourselves in. So, for example, today, financially, you have a situation where there's debt is a stimulant, or credit. You provide credit, you get debt. And so when you need a lot of buying power, central banks inject a lot of money and credit. And when when they don't have a limit on it, like in some eras, it was gold that was a limit. And they would think, how much money do I have? And that would affect how much they spend. That is no longer the case. So that there is that stimulant, but that stimulant of creating credit creates debt, which is an obligation for paying back, and it is an asset for somebody on the other side to hold, to think whether they're having a real return. So there's a mechanics to that set of circumstances. That means when you have a lot of debt and you have a lot of assets and liabilities that are there, you have to make both sides happy. And so the situation that we're going through is very much that. The coffers are empty. They needed to spend money, and they chose to spend a lot of money on debt. And that produced an inflation, because it's buying power. It should not be surprising if you give everybody a lot of buying power, and it's much more than there is production, that'll produce a lot of inflation. And so now we are where we are, in which the central bank is tightening monetary policy. What that means is removing buying power. So you see a situation where prices are going up, and the central bank will remove buying power. And that creates a stagflation environment, and we've seen that repeat over a period of time. Now, when that happens, at the same time as the second influence, that there's a lot of wealth gap and a lot of populism of each side, then there's a lot of conflict, naturally, internal. And populism, where does populism come from? Studying history, we see these patterns. When Donald Trump was elected in 2016, and I wanted to understand why. And that was the first time a populist was elected in the United States under my experience. So I went back and studied populism. And populism occurs when a disenfranchised group says, this is not working for me, and they want a fighter, not a compromiser. to be able to fight for them. And so traditionally, there are populists of the left and populists of the right. So we see this through history. You study the 30s, and you see the internal conflicts of fighters. And that threatens the system. It threatens democracy. 4 major democracies in the 1930s went from democracies to autocracies because of that. And when that happens at the same time as there's comparable power between 2 great empires at odds, and there's fighters that they will tend to then fight, because we do not have a judicial system, a global judicial system that resolves disputes. So that's the dynamic that you see, and I can take you through how it goes from one world order. It goes, and preceding all those, each world order is a war for control. And then there's a cycle that happens until there's another war and a new world order, because the new world order is the new system, dominated by the new dominant power. So we see that happen repeatedly, and we know where we are. We know where we are. Yes, what you see is, like I say, 5 types of war. So there's a trade war, there's a technology war, there's a geopolitical influence war, then there's a capital and economic war that accelerates when there is this great power conflict, because it's the weaponization of capital markets and economies that are actually used to hurt the other. For example, in Japan, in the United States, they froze the financial assets, and they then also embargoed oil, that they couldn't get oil in. And so this economic warfare takes place. And then when the economic warfare becomes intolerable, then that often leads to a military war. For example, it was those military sanctions, that's economic warfare, that happened in Japan that led to Pearl Harbor beginning. That's a typical. We know where we are. We don't necessarily have to go to cross those lines. Okay, so we do have our financial conditions, and we do have our internal conditions, which are leading to these irreconcilable differences. And we do have our international conditions in this economic warfare. But if the parties involved really understand these patterns and understand the cost of that and the cost of the war, then perhaps we can avoid them. I'm just trying to make people aware of the story that's repeated over and over again, and looks like where we are is in a almost a brink of very bad situation.